and importance of this concept, especially in the context of the public sector, and we'll provide as well some basic considerations if we are to undertake some estimation of public sector productivity. And for day 2, we're going to cover some of the details of the steps and how you may estimate public sector productivity, and look into the details as well of how we may analyze productivity related information. In between the 2-day sessions, we're going to present, share with you some results of the productivity calculations that we did for the public schools in the Philippines. And for day 2, if time permits, we will also share with you some illustrations of the results when we did the calculation for selected public hospitals. So to begin with, let me briefly elaborate on the meaning and importance of productivity measurement. As many, perhaps some of those who have attended the various webinars of the Academy, I believe some of you are familiar with the concept of productivity. But allow me to quote very important definition as provided by the OECD. So it says here that productivity is commonly defined as the ratio of a volume measure of output to a volume measure of input use. That definition is very much close to or similar to how it was defined by the Asian Productivity Organization, wherein we have this handbook on productivity. So it says here that productivity is the relationship between the quantity of output and that are used in the quantity of inputs that are used in the production of or delivery of outputs and services. So you'll notice that the concept is practically illustrated as the ratio between dealing with physical measures of outputs and inputs. So quantity, volume, and so on. So that's a very important consideration if you're going to look into the details of the measurement of productivity. Having said that, the definition of productivity, we could say that our productivity depends on how we do what we do, whether we are in the public sector or in the private sector. And if we are concerned about producing more outputs or delivering more services, and in relation to the inputs or resources that we use, optimal productivity will really depend on how we use the resources that we have, and how we perform related processes in converting inputs to meaningful outputs. Having said that, let me highlight now the importance of productivity. So in this slide, you will introduce that productivity is an indicator of our ability to harness our physical and human resources with the intention of producing better goods and services, or more goods and services, and generate wealth for the entire economy. And that should help us support or improve the standards of living. So at the national level, you may have heard about gross domestic gain, socioeconomic growth through productivity. So the economic growth of a country may be driven by two important parameters. One is growth can be achieved, or high growth can be achieved, if you increase our productive assets or increase our total factor productivity. So this is the subject of our discussion today, looking into the details of productivity. So if we have a productive asset and we are able to optimize the use of that, then that would lead to increased productivity. So combining increases in productive assets and productivity, that should help us achieve higher growth. And that higher growth will hopefully contribute to improving our quality of life. With this framework, we are saying that productivity is an intermediate objective. And our ultimate goal really is to achieve better quality of life. And if you're going to trace growth through increase in productivity, typically this may be achieved through improvements in the systems and processes. We invest in research and development, we invest in human resource development, and through application of technologies and improve how we utilize productive assets, that should now give us or register a better or higher growth for the economy. Now the question is, what then is the role of the public sector? So the public sector, or particularly the government, should provide favorable environment to improve the capability of wealth-generating sectors to achieve higher growth. And that may be achieved by the government by improving its services by itself. So we have to improve our own public sector productivity to contribute in realizing higher growth for the economy. So with this as a general framework, we can then now look into the details of the public sector. As we know, the public sector operations covers diverse fields. We are into health, education, defense, provision of infrastructure, etc. So given the diverse nature of the government, we could say that the sector is actually one of the major deliverer of services. In fact, a large part of the production of goods and services in the economy came from the public sector. And we all know that the government also use a lot of resources, not only human resources, but even the use of the tax revenue that we generate through various activities. So given the public sector operations and its
recording in progress.
Let me just and its role in building the country, we can look into pertinent issues. So the question is, are all resources being used efficiently in the public sector? Are we optimizing the delivery of goods and services to the public to improve the well-being of every citizen? So given the limited resources in the government and recognizing the many challenges that we are facing, at the end of the day, we would like to, of course, improve the delivery of our services. And we all know that the citizens, they want more and better services from the government, from the public sector. And in this situation, we are always facing these constraints on how then can we raise more revenue to support and cater to the increasing demands of the citizens. And of course, citizens do not want to pay more taxes if we are going to take that as an option. So there is this very strong pressure to manage the costs incurred by the government, and therefore the topic on productivity is really very, very important. So now we move on to this concept of productivity measurement. So if we define productivity as the ratio of output over input, so the measurement of this can be explained as our approach to determine such relationship. between useful or meaningful outputs that we generated and the resources that we have utilized for a given period of time. So having obtained and or determined such relationship, it is now our role to analyze the characteristics of such relationship and use that information for or in improving public sector productivity. There are many ways by which productivity information can be used. Some organizations, especially in the private sector, they may use this for productivity gain sharing, to help motivate individuals. This can also be used to determine management options in case we are contemplating on a number of strategic options. Productivity analysis can help identify areas for improvement and for significant reform. So there are many uses of the productivity information, but let me center on the very essence of doing public sector productivity measurement. The main goal in doing this is really to improve public sector productivity. The rest, whether you use it for productivity-based budgeting, provision of feedback, and so on, those are okay, but really the more important thing is to make use of the information to improve the overall productivity. Having said that, before we proceed, as you continue viewing this presentation, I'd like to encourage your participation. So throughout the session, we will have some short quizzes which our secretariat may use in checking your participation in this webinar. So this is a very short and practical question, and we can probably answer this in just 1 or 2 minutes. So if we are ready, so by the way, the questions have corresponding scores. So for those viewers who can generate perfect score or provide the correct answers to all of these questions, they may get some recognition from our secretariat. To begin with our 10-point question, if you're ready, please chat your responses to our social media platforms so that our secretariat may recognize your answers. So for the first question, so in your opinion, which of the following is the most important reason why public sector productivity is crucial? Letter A, public sector is a major employer. Letter B, public sector is a major producer of goods. C, public sector is a consumer of tax resources. And D, public sector is a major provider of services. So you may just type in the letters, and our secretariat will note down all your answers for consideration later. So I'm going to pause for about 15-30 seconds for you to provide your answers, and then we'll resume shortly. Okay, I believe they have done so. So for this question, actually there is no right or wrong answer because it is your opinion. So for those who type in their answers, you will get 10 points for this question. Congratulations for those who answered. Okay, let me now move on to our second topic. So at this point, I will outline the key considerations in estimating public sector productivity. I listed down some 7 of them, and we will go through each of these items in the succeeding slides. So let me begin with item number 1. So on the purpose of measuring public sector productivity, this is practically the most important factor to consider. If you're going to measure public sector productivity, be very clear with your purpose. Why are we measuring PSP? Are we measuring it to analyze and improve productivity performance? Or would you like to examine the outcome of productivity changes in relation to societal goals or organizational outcomes? And therefore, you can check how the changes in productivity are affecting your program or policy outcomes. You may also be interested in measuring public sector productivity to track productivity changes and some other reasons for measuring public sector productivity. So let me highlight that of the 7 items, this is the most important item to consider. If you're going to measure productivity in the public sector, be very clear with your purpose, because that will affect a number of activities in doing the estimation of public sector productivity. The second point is this consideration of the outcome of productivity changes. In this illustration, you will see at the bottom of this chart that productivity is output over input. So that's fine. We have defined that earlier. And effectiveness is illustrated here as the ratio between outcomes and or the inputs. So given this illustration, you will see that changes in productivity could affect may affect the outcomes of the organization. So if you're going to venture on productivity improvement initiatives, we have to always check whether such changes in productivity will indeed contribute in improving your organizational outcomes, because there are situations whereby a decline in productivity is desired because we would like to generate better organizational results. So this is the illustration of that. When we did a calculation of productivity in the public schools in the Philippines, notice the downward trend in productivity, the total productivity. And if you look at this is another illustration of estimation of productivity, and the outcome considerations I will share in the case material after this main topic. I'll show to you the results. So this is another illustration. In the UK, they have been doing estimation of productivity in the public sector. In fact, I believe the UK is one of the best practices in calculating public sector productivity and making use of the information for different policy reforms. So those are to illustrate how public sector productivity may be calculated. Now, third point, if you're going to measure public sector productivity, let us recognize this framework pertaining to results linkages. Any government organization has a mandate, and we use that mandate in crafting our strategic objectives. That typically those objectives are translated into our policies and programs, and those policies and programs are delivered through certain processes and projects to produce outputs. And when we deliver the outputs will then create capabilities and capacities that may transition to organizational outcomes and help us realize the benefits that will help us achieve our objectives. So in this diagram, the question is, where is productivity? If you look at this diagram, it's important to recognize that the change in productivity, meaning the ratio between outputs delivered and the inputs or resources utilized, the improvement is the way we in productivity will definitely affect how the capabilities that we are creating, and that will then affect the benefits that we are trying to deliver or realize. So be very aware of these linkages, because analysis of productivity should not end by simply seeing the changes in productivity. It should give us insights on how these changes are contributing to better organizational outcomes and how this may contribute in realizing the policy benefits or program benefits that we are implementing. So that's another factor to consider, but actually this is related to the previous one. And this is another reference that you can use under the APO Manual of Public Sector Productivity. You'll find there a section by which the different types of public services, some key inputs, activities, and outputs were outlined, as well as the important outcomes for each public service. For instance, in health, it's very important to recognize that at the end of the day, when we deliver health-related services, we would like everyone to achieve better quality of life, longer life, or even enhanced employment prospects for them. Same thing with education, social care, etc. So you'll find this APO Manual of Public Sector Productivity very useful. Now, the fourth item for consideration in estimating public sector productivity would be the levels of analysis. So the public sector productivity can be analyzed at the agency or even individual levels. You can do that. Department level, you can estimate productivity. Likewise, productivity can be determined for a cluster of hospitals, schools, or organizations. So that may form part of the subsector level, or industry level, or sectoral level, or national level. So depending on the level, or depending on the purpose of measurement, we have to ensure that the level of analysis is supporting or supportive of the purpose of measurement. It will be very difficult to generate productivity information for a given macro level purpose if you're estimating or drawing the productivity estimates at a much lower level. So you have to align these things in doing the productivity calculations and analysis. Just to illustrate, when we try to estimate the productivity for a cluster of public hospitals in the country, we're able to generate this result. And we try to examine also the productivity of a particular hospital. And the trend came out to be different. So we have here. So which means that at different levels, you can actually estimate productivity. And therefore, the analysis should support your overall intention in doing the estimation. Now, fifth point to consider would refer to the availability and quality of data. So if you recall that productivity is a ratio between the quantity of the outputs in services relative to the quantity of inputs that we have utilized. Therefore, the data that we will use in estimating the outputs and the inputs will be very, very important. And of course, we cannot do the estimation if one of the data that you need will not be available, or the quality of that data in terms of consistency in coming up with a series or estimates for several years, then analysis will then be affected. If you would like to get some guidance on the possible types of data that we may consider for each type of as a very good reference, as it provides this classification of functions of government for the government services, and it outlines the different types of outputs and input measures there. So feel free to refer to that manual. Again, the availability of the data, since we are primarily interested on the physical measures of outputs and inputs for the services and inputs or resources utilized, might there be situations wherein the data are in monetary values? We have to be aware that such data that we have are affected by price changes. So in estimating productivity, we have to minimize or eliminate the effects of price changes, because we're dealing with physical units of measure in estimating the PST. And if we are to make use of monetary values, then we probably have to make use some deflators to estimate the quantity of inputs and outputs. And in case our interest is more on a single factor productivity, then we have to consider the availability of data as well. So with this, in the case example that we will illustrate tomorrow for the public hospital, some of the output estimates were based on proxy data. In this case, we use the number of inpatients served or outpatients. So these are proxy estimates of the services rendered by the hospital. So I can make use of that, as well as for the inputs, pretty much available. The number of health professionals in the hospitals, the number of beds, you can refer to statistics available. Energy consumption is not easy to find in a number of reports, but capital expenditure through amount are reflected in terms of depreciation that you can find in the financial reports of the hospitals, as well as the operating expenses. But the actual disbursements, you have to find it in a different report, possibly from COA report. So again, depending on your purpose of measurement, the availability of data, estimations will likewise be affected. Quality, of course, there are many indicators of quality in the public hospital operations. And typically, because of the performance-based bonus we have in the public sector, many of the organizations would have these estimated hospital satisfaction levels. No? Typically, this is available. And for some hospitals, they would have percentage of inpatients with hospital-acquired infection, but not all of them would have that. Also, the percentage of relapse cases, others would have this, others don't have. And reduction in medical errors, that's very difficult to find in public hospitals. Another point to consider would be the information needs of the user of productivity information. So depending again on the purpose, some users of information may be interested about static measure of productivity, meaning the ratio of a particular output in relation to a particular input. In this case, as illustrated, say we have number of clients served in relation to the number of employees. So you'll get a static measure of 30 or 31.5. But if you look at this static measure, some would ask, so is it good or bad? So if you compare the two, then possibly you will be able to say that productivity may have improved or it went down, depending on the situation. So when we are concerned about the information, productivity information, dynamic measure productivity will be more appropriate rather than static measure. So that will depend, again, on the user of productivity information. Some users are more interested about partial productivity estimate, or others probably are concerned about the total productivity estimate or multi-factor productivity estimate. So these things can be computed or calculated depending on your purpose of measuring productivity. For profit-oriented government organizations like GOCCs or the government-owned and controlled corporations, they're more concerned about the relationship between productivity, profitability, and profitability. And we have a methodology to account for the changes in productivity and how every percentage change in productivity would impact on the profitability of the organization. And in this simplified illustration of the equation, I could say that the profitability index of a profit-oriented public sector organization is equal to its productivity index multiplied by the price recovery index. So it's a long calculation, but what I'm saying is model such as this is available depending on how we want and how deep you would like to examine the changes in productivity in relation to other concerns of the organization. Now, to illustrate that previous framework or concern, allow me to introduce this time this 9-point diagram to illustrate the relationship between profitability and productivity. As we know, if we are profit-oriented organization, our profitability will be affected by the change in revenue or sales in relation to the change in our expenses or cost of inputs. So higher revenue with the same input, higher profits, of course. If you have higher inputs for the same level of revenue, then your profitability will go down. So, but what will affect the change in revenue? In this illustration, you could say that if your organization is able to produce more outputs, that's the quantity of outputs, and you're able to sell them at a higher price, definitely that will affect your revenue. In like manner, for our expenses, for our inputs or cost of inputs, the total cost that we incur in generating such revenue will be affected by the change in the quantity of our inputs and the change in price of those inputs. In most cases, in many private organizations that are not concerned about productivity, typically every change in the price of inputs, they will simply pass this on to their customers by simply adjusting or increasing the price of their services. But in some cases, we cannot simply do that. For exporting companies, that will be very, very difficult. I remember that recent situation now in the public transport, wherein the drivers are complaining because the cost of fuel has been increasing, and yet they cannot increase their fare, the rates that they're charging to the riding public. So in the end, they will have lower profits. So how then can we achieve higher profit if we cannot change the prices? So we can probably gain additional profits by improving our productivity, by optimizing our resources, by changing how we do things, applying new technologies, and improving our skills, quality of people working on it, and maybe doing some better products, delivering better products and services. No? The change in price of outputs and change in price of inputs is what we call change in price recovery. So as illustrated earlier, it is a normal tendency of some organizations that for every increase in the cost of inputs, they will pass it on to the customers by increasing the price of their products and services. But in our situation now, that's going to be very, very difficult because that can lead to serious problems when it comes to inflation. So the way to go under this very tight economic situation is really to improve our productivity to achieve some higher profitability. So this is a very useful framework if we are the government organization that is concerned about profits, like the many public enterprises expected to contribute revenue to the government. Okay. For non-profit generating government organizations, so this is the framework that we can use. We are concerned about productivity, but we are not concerned about profitability. So what will affect our methods of calculation? We have to determine the total of the combined outputs and services by coming up with output weights based on their relative share to the expenditures in delivering such public services or outputs. So the illustration that I will share is based on this approach. No? Another way to look at this framework is this model developed by Dan Levy and Carrera. This is also published in many related references, whereby the productivity estimates is using output and input indices. So the output index, these are estimated based on the relative cost weights. So we weigh the outputs because we cannot simply combine the different outputs. We have to assign some weights, and the way to do that using available data is to get the weights relative to expenditure share. Similarly, for the inputs, we cannot simply combine physical measures of inputs. We also have to assign some weight when we combine them before we are able to calculate for the indices that you will then use to calculate for productivity. So that will be the focus of our illustration later on. Another option to consider, instead of getting the weight based on the relative share to the expenditure, we can probably consider an approach whereby we look into the outcomes. So based on the relative contribution of outputs in achieving better organizational outcomes, then we can make use of that as a way to provide or estimate the weight of each type of output or service that we are delivering. So as we know, different organizations, different agencies would have different types of outputs or services, and we can simply combine them together to get the total. So as I mentioned, to add all of these outputs, you can use their relative share, weighted share, in the expenditure or weighted based on their contribution to outcome. Okay, so before proceeding further, let's check if you are still with me. At this point, you're going to have a 20-point question. And just like the previous one, just type in your answers by selecting the letter, and that should be your evidence of participation in this webinar. So for 20 points, here's the question. In measuring public sector productivity, which of the following is most important factor to consider? Is it the purpose of measuring public sector productivity, the availability of data, information needs of the user of productivity information, or the outcome of activity changes? So let me give you a few seconds to type in your answers. So hopefully our secretariat is able to keep track of your answers for proper recognition later. Okay, so for this question, which is 20 points, as I explained earlier, the key factor to consider should be your purpose of measurement. So that's the letter A, no? Okay, so for those who answered letter A should get 20 points for this question. Okay, now we move on to an illustration of estimating productivity. In this case, we are going to focus on the public schools. By public schools, I mean the primary and secondary schools in the country. If you look at the national objectives for education, depending on the level, especially for the basic education, the objective is really to provide quality basic education to achieve functional literacy. And for another level or group of educational institutions, those that provide technical vocational skills. So they would like to achieve a competitive technical vocational skills training. And for higher education, we would like to realize more relevant and responsive higher education. Those are very important to look into. And if you are going to examine the education service delivery in the country, we have what we call the trifocal system. We have the basic education, the higher education, and the technical vocational. So preschool, that would refer to kindergarten education, elementary, primary, and so on. In some cases, we have universities that also provide secondary, higher, and technical education services. For the private, it can be a mixture of this depending on their school. Now, recognizing this, we have to look into the possible measures of outputs in the public school. In this case, we make use of proxy estimates of the education outputs by way of simply looking at the number of students served, or number of graduates, or number of exam passers. But for purposes of the exercise, we made use of the number of students served. And in terms of inputs, there are a number of them. We can look into the number of teachers, number of schoolrooms, energy consumption, and down the line. You can easily find some data on the number of teachers in schoolrooms. So these are proxy estimates of the inputs used for in providing the education services for in the public sector, the public school. Now, quality. There are many reports that would show changes in cohort survival rate, program accreditation, achievement rate, etc. And sometimes some schools would have student satisfaction rating. So this may be considered as quality indicators, but again, we have to reckon with the purpose of the measurement. For purposes of illustration, we relied heavily on the available data, not much on the overall purpose of making use this for some policy analysis. So here is the result of that estimation. Notice the downward trend in total productivity that somehow follows the downward trend in labor productivity. For intermediate inputs, use of other supplies and materials and so on, we noted a different trend. And for the capital, in this case, we largely relied on data pertaining to depreciation. So very clear the downward trend in productivity was observed, the general downward trend. And that may be supported by these details on the number of students per teacher. During the early days or years, we noticed that the number of the average number of students per teacher is around 40. And somehow it was realized that such number is quite big if we are to effect meaningful outcome. So that issue was addressed by hiring more teachers. So if we consider the number of students served as the measure of proxy measure of the outputs, and teacher as the proxy estimate of the input. So if we have declining number of students per teacher, definitely the trend will be will go down, as shown here. Similarly, there were concerns about the number of students per school room. As you know, if the public school is crowded with so many students, you won't expect better educational outcomes. So the effort was made to increase the number of classrooms given the increasing number of student population. And therefore, if you divide the number of students per year relative to the number of schoolrooms, you'll find that this downward trend of the total for secondary was this for elementary was also increasing. So now, concerned about the quality of education, we have to look into available data as well, since positive learning outcome is very crucial in examining the service quality provided by the schools. No, so productivity estimates may have to look into these quality or outcome parameters to see how changes in productivity are indeed contributing to better quality of education services. So here is one indicator or data to show the annual dropout rates in the public elementary and secondary schools. You can see it has been declining during this study period, and that's a good sign that the dropout rates has been declining. And likewise, if you look at the annual test success rate for the same period, notice the upward trend. So this is a better, it shows an improving outcomes or results arising from the many reforms introduced in the public schools. No? So better test results or success rates were noted. And so given the trifocal education system in the country, our agencies have to perform separate monitoring and evaluation of functions with different measures of outcome. So if we are to expand the study to cover the other levels of education, we have to recognize the objectives pertaining to such to the mandates of these agencies. Now, some key challenges that we noted. So, although the measures of basic education quality are generally available, and you will find them in a number of reports, especially from DepEd, the estimates of public sector productivity were very, very limited. Hardly you will find this in many of the statistics available. And we also took note of the limited resources provided in the basic education to cope with the rapidly expanding student population. But despite that situation, during the study period, as you may have observed, the ratios between the number of students per teacher and the ratio between the number of students per classroom has been improving. So issues related to slow improvement in the quality of education may persist if productivity related issues are ignored. To highlight that the downward trends in productivity may be offset by improving trends in basic education outcomes. So the problem here is if the educational outcomes are declining and productivity is likewise declining, then we have a serious problem. So it's a better situation if both productivity and basic education outcomes are improving, but that's ideal. But for this study, I could say that a number of reforms that were introduced to address issues pertaining to the limited number of teachers in classroom were indeed very useful in improving the educational outcomes, very effective. Although you may have noticed the decline in productivity, but that's okay, provided we are able to achieve better outcomes. So the enhanced effectiveness of basic education services may be attributed to improvement in the student-teacher ratio that went down from 39 to 30 during the study period. Also, if we are to maintain such effective level of student-teacher and student classroom ratios, making education facilities more accessible to the public, these are very important productivity parameters to consider in coming up with related policies. So if we are achieving better results in terms of outcomes, then we can probably maintain ideal levels on the student teacher and the student classroom ratios. So this may include possibilities to improve our learning environment and bringing down the cost of education, addressing teaching capacity and capability gaps, and even looking into measures to align the basic education curriculum to meet the changing demands for higher education and gainful employment. So we're not just looking at the resource side, but we also have to look into how the education services are delivered through improved curriculum and teaching methodologies or techniques. So with that, we're hoping that we are able to share with you the meaning and importance of public sector productivity measurement and the key considerations in doing so were discussed and shared with you through this illustration. So thank you very much. At this point, I think we have time for questions and answers. Back to you, Nico.
Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation, Sir Arnel. Actually, sir, my key takeaway is that the main goal of productivity measurement is to always contribute to the improvement of productivity of our public services and the public sector as a whole. So, at the moment, we are experiencing some issues in our live stream and we are unable to get questions from our viewers real time. But don't worry, sir. We have prepared some pertinent questions that are very relevant to what you have shared with us this afternoon. Sir, for our first question, we often productivity, yes. How can we define them separately, sir, to avoid confusion?
Okay, sometimes we use it productivity performance. Well, broadly, performance can be measured in many different ways. Performance may refer to how well we achieved our organizational objectives and so on. So it's a broad term, and for purposes of productivity, productivity is just one indicator that you may consider in evaluating organizational or individual performance. So it's just one. Productivity is just one. And there are many other performance indicators. You may talk about quality, you may talk about timeliness, and things like that. No, so to minimize confusion, always consider that productivity is just one of the indicators of performance.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Thank you, sir, for that. Sir, next question is, how can we select appropriate outputs to measure given the myriads of outputs to choose from?
Okay. The outputs can be measured, although this is going to be discussed tomorrow. There are key considerations in choosing the outputs for estimation of productivity. Again, we will go back to what is your purpose for measuring productivity. Based on that, you should be guided by what is more important and relevant outputs to consider. At times, you may consider the outputs that will contribute most to your organizational outcomes. This is a very important one to consider. Others would look into the outputs that that consumes a lot of our resources, time and effort. So, well, again, depending on your purpose of measurement. But tomorrow we are going to elaborate on that when we go into the details on how you may estimate outputs and inputs.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Next question. Can we use outcome measures to estimate productivity directly instead of just outputs?
Okay. But the meaning will be different if we are going to do that. If we are going to strictly follow the technical definition of productivity, then it will go beyond that traditional definition of output over input. But of course, if you want to measure outcome in relation to inputs, in fact, in many cases, if you are proposing for a program, or if you have a policy proposal, you will encounter this benefit cost ratio or cost benefit analysis. That's commonly used and also provides some meaningful information. But if we will redefine productivity in this context, by all means, we can consider that. But if you will limit the definition based on the technical definition of quantity of output over input, then such definition will go beyond the traditional one.
Okay, so the traditional one is input over
output over
output over input.
Physical measures.
Physical measure. Okay, sir. Sir, next question. You've mentioned earlier that the availability and quality of data is one of the main considerations in PSP measurement. However, we know that access to availability and quality of data remains a challenge to date. What action steps, sir, can you recommend that we must implement to somehow overcome this one?
First of all, we have to get the buy-in of the users of productivity information. If they find meaning to the productivity information, and if it will help them identify the productivity gaps, so that we can focus our attention on these areas for improvement, then I think the access to information should not be an issue. And usually the access to information is a challenge if you don't subscribe to the purpose of measuring productivity. So I guess the main
Intellect. Best for that, how do you suggest ways for the public to appreciate more the importance of measuring public sector productivity? I think the question's coming from the idea that we already have performance monitoring in the public sector. So how do we encourage the public to appreciate more measuring public sector productivity?
one is, of course, we can make this part of the incentives, but just like in other country, I believe in Malaysia it was used to give incentives on high performing and productive agencies. That's one way if we can consider that. But the issue there is if you remove the incentive, we're going to continue looking into productivity related issues. I'm not quite supportive of the idea of using this for providing incentive to individuals. Rather, it may be more meaningful at the organizational level rather than individual, because at the end of the day, the results, productivity is a result of how we do what we do. Given that the better results can be achieved through collaboration, cooperation, or engagement of everyone. So to promote such and help everybody appreciate how better productivity will bring us closer to the people, I think we can change the mindset on this. So we have to demonstrate the use of productivity information in improving the delivery of services to the people and making these improvements recognized by the people themselves. So if we are doing productivity improvements, but at the end of the day, nobody recognizes the result, then we will have a problem. In the private sector, there's a clear link between productivity changes, profitability, and what's in it for everybody. The incentives, the bonuses, productivity bonus, etc. That's very clear to them. In our case, in the public sector, we have productivity incentives bonus that may not be necessarily derived through productivity calculation. So that's the problem there. So loosely, we are using productivity definition, but it's very important to look into this, because given the situation we are in now, the effects of the pandemic, and now we have these problems on the increasing prices of oil. The more our resources will become very, very limited in the public sector, especially the fiscal issue. So we really have to find better ways to improve our services, and productivity is really one of the options, strategic options to consider. If you recall the diagram for analyzing productivity strategies, it will give us idea on where the organization is given changes in our operating costs. In the private sector, you will lose your business if you will simply pass on to the public or to the consumers the effects of price changes. sooner or later you're out of business if you continue doing that. But if you make use of that framework, assuming that we're not concerned about profits, but we are more concerned about outcomes, which
The services itself, sir.
if the outcomes can be improved through better productivity, then we have to examine how well we can improve our systems, our people, our technology, because that at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we gain the citizens' trust and confidence. And we cannot always ask for, okay, pay me more taxes. I don't think we can do that.
Thank you so much. I concur with that, sir. Sir, we have questions coming from YouTube, from Jomi. How to convince management to see productivity improvement measures as viable should be taken when the current plantilla of an organization time and time again achieves as an ever-growing number of targets?
Yeah, that's the reality in the
a
government.
tough question to sir.
That's very, very real, no? We have these increasing targets every year, and yet our resources are limited and may not increase the way our targets are increasing, no? So for the management to appreciate this, if we can come up with a good analysis of productivity, it should help us identify productivity gaps. And when you look at those productivity gaps, it will give you options on how to deal with this situation, because we cannot keep on asking for more budget, more. And as we know, we are facing this limited resources. So how else can we achieve or deliver better organizational outputs if we will not improve the way we do things? So technology is one, but the other thing is the attitude of everyone. If in your analysis, you will find that one of the reasons why we're not achieving higher performance is because our technology or our people need to improve their competencies. Then we have to provide evidence regarding that, and productivity analysis will help us provide such focus. Sabi nga, you cannot be optimistic with a misty optic. The main purpose of productivity measurement is to gain focus.
Gain focus.
Yeah, so if you can make use of the evidence to provide such focus, then it will help them make a sound decision on this issue.
Thank you, sir. Sir, question from Iris Faye Villardo Lopez. Who should be responsible for implementing and monitoring agency productivity? Should a position be created, or is this a task for an existing position?
Well, it's everybody's responsibility, especially middle management and top management or our senior management. Because productivity, as explained, it's a result. Remember, the results change. So we have the mandate, and we convert that into policies and programs. We deliver them through processes, projects, and so on to come up with our outputs or services. And that output will then will realize the outcomes and the benefits. No? So given such change, the management should always be concerned about results. We can leave the concerns on outputs to the process owners because at the end of the day, they are the ones producing the outputs, doing the activities, and so on. So we can leave it to them. But the outcome, the results, is the primary concern of the management. So we cannot say that, okay, let's have somebody to be responsible for this. Estimation-wise, it can be assigned to, say, those with access to data. But the use of information should always be part of the responsibility of the management. So if you're asking who should perform this. Probably if you're just looking about who may be assigned to gather the data, who may be assigned to do the estimation. Well, for those who have access to data, that yeah, we can assign the calculation. But the use of the results is the responsibility of the management.
Results-based approach.
Results of the estimates, whether
Yes.
productivity is changing or improving, and the outcomes are improving, the analysis there, so it should be the management.
Yes, sir. Sir, I think we can accommodate one more question from Miss Faye. Miss Faye Corpus. What is the ideal ratio of student-teacher?
A difficult question. But in some cases, I heard that the more effective ratio is around 20-25. To be very effective, because it gives the opportunity for the teacher to give more time to every student. You can just imagine if the ratio is 40, just like in the case that we studied early years. That's the case, even higher than 40. So how will the teacher give time to each student? In some advanced countries, in fact, they have to control that to optimum level, because yeah, every student should be given the proper attention to improve their learning. So to me, it should be around that number. 30, I believe, is still high. If you can afford to lower it to about 25, or that should be the average, I believe. I don't know if we can achieve that. Yeah. In fact, there is this practice in other countries that 1:1. That's
the ideal situation, sir.
Very difficult for us, given our situation.
All right. Actually, it's unfortunate that we are having some trouble gathering the questions real time. But to our viewers, please feel free to still comment down your questions, and we will try to answer them even after this session. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you to our resource person. Thank you, Sir Arnel Abanto, the Vice President and Managing Director of the Productivity and Development Center of the Development Academy of the Philippines, who will also be with us tomorrow at the second day of the webinar series entitled Estimating Public Sector Productivity. We will be flashing on screen the link and the QR code for Session 1 evaluation so you may accomplish them after watching this episode.
Hello. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir. Malinaw po.
Okay, thank you.
Sir, may mga questions po kaming nakuha from day one replay. Pwede po natin siyang sagutin mamaya at during po the Q&A ng session.
So ano yung mga questions nila?
Sir, basahin ko po yung isa sa mga questions. From YouTube po ito kahapon, supposedly kahapon. Can we include employability of the graduates as measurement of productivity, especially for CHED and TESDA? Then another question, sir.
Outcome na yun. Oh.
Outcome na nga po ito. Another question, sir. From Facebook naman po. If productivity is measured in terms of the bottom line or net income, is there a way to compute productivity to show its contribution to the net income? Medyo complicated,
Yes.
sir.
That's the productivity accounting approach.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Again, my name is Miko from the Development Academy of the Philippines, your host for today. For this week's webisode, we will focus on measuring public sector productivity. In the first session, Director Arnel Abanto introduced us to public sector productivity measurement. He also discussed the importance and significance of measuring the productivity of the public sector. Meanwhile, the second part of the series will be about estimating public sector productivity. Just a few reminders. Don't forget to like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube account to get the latest updates and information on public sector productivity. You can also share this webinar so that we will reach more audiences in the public sector. Kindly post in as well your questions in the comment section of our social media platforms. Our colleagues and social media moderators will receive them, and we will try to answer some of them during the Q&A session. So without further ado, let's welcome again our resource person for Day 2, Estimating Public Sector Productivity. Everyone, please send your virtual hearts again to our resource person, Director Arnel D. Abanto. Good afternoon, Sir Arnel.
Good afternoon, Miko, and pleasant day to everyone. Welcome to the second half of our webinar on public sector productivity measurement. So allow me to share my screen. Can you see my screen now, Miko?
Yes, sir. Clear po.
Okay, thank you. So again, welcome to the second half of our webinar. So at this point, we'll be covering the steps in estimating public sector productivity using appropriate methodology, and towards the end, we'll provide some discussions on how we may analyze productivity information. And we will try to look into some issues and challenges in doing this estimation of public sector productivity. And if time permits, we're going to share with you the results of our productivity estimates of selected public hospitals. So yesterday we talked about, we shared with you the results of our estimates of productivity of public schools. So this time we're going to introduce public hospitals. So to proceed with our session, we outlined these steps in estimating public sector productivity based on how we did this in actual practice. So at the very start of the step, of course, we have to be clear about the purpose for doing this. And we also have to recognize who will use the productivity information, and for what purpose the information will be used. No? So we discussed that lengthily yesterday. So for today, we're going to focus more on in identifying the key outputs and input measures, and look into the approach to estimate the productivity, then come up with some measures that you can adapt depending on your intention, and then go into the analysis later. So to again highlight the key elements in doing this, we always have to reckon with the outcomes of the service or the organizational outcomes, because by understanding the outcomes of the organization, it will give us a clearer perspective on the more meaningful outputs and inputs to be considered in estimating the productivity. So yesterday we highlighted that one of the key considerations in measuring public sector productivity is to consider the the linkage between productivity and outcomes. In the reference manual that we mentioned, the APO manual on public sector productivity, you will find there a number of sections that provides examples on the different types of public services and the kinds of inputs, activities, and outputs, as well as the outcomes. Having seen this reference, it provides clear linkages between the more important outputs and inputs that will you may consider to understand the behavior of the organizational or service outcomes. So for instance, in healthcare, of course, the expected outcomes would be more on the physical and mental well-being of the patients or the individuals. Broadly, every citizen should be able to achieve or demonstrate this physical and mental well-being. But might there be health issues, then they have to approach a health facility. And there you go, the hospitals will have to provide the necessary services to achieve that health outcomes for the individual. So looking into this perspective, we can now go into the details of the kinds of outputs that we may consider. So to begin with the estimation of outputs and as well as the inputs, let me quickly define what we mean by public sector outputs. Generally speaking, when we talk of outputs, it should represent the product of our operation, or it may be a result of our special interest. So if we are in the private sector, it's very important to look into these outputs that may possibly be useful or that will meet the expectations of the customers. But in the public sector, the goods or services produced by the government may not be easily quantifiable or measurable compared with the private sector. And we will always encounter that in the government. When we talk about outputs, we sometimes refer to the service or services provided by the agency to the citizen. So there are many examples of outputs in the public sector, but let me just provide some key questions in selecting your key organizational output or systems outputs. So foremost to this list, so we would like to know which of these output is important to realize your purpose of measuring productivity. Do we want to measure productivity for purposes of coming up with an incentive scheme? Or are we measuring this because we would like to compare our performance productivity levels across years or across agencies? Or do we want to identify areas for improvement? So we have to be very clear on this because that will definitely affect the kinds of outputs and inputs that we will consider. Another point to consider is to look into the characteristics of these outputs that may have a direct or indirect contribution to your organizational outcomes. So which output drives changes in the organizational outcomes? There are agencies. Now, if you look at the different services that they provide to the public, some of these are directly related to their mandate. Others were added because they feel that these services are necessary for them to render their main service to the public. For instance, we came across of a number of regulatory agencies that, according to their mandate, the main service is for them to provide regulatory services, particularly licensing services. But in the course of their implementation of that mandate, they realized that maybe for the licensees or the businesses to comply with the licensing requirements, so they thought of maybe one of the key requirements for licensing, the applicants should be trained on the licensing requirements. So that became a requirement in their licensing process. And then they eventually they recognized that the variations in terms of the compliance of the licensees, they thought that maybe the training providers, those that provide training for the licensees, should be accredited by the regulatory agency. So from licensing operations, they now have an accreditation service. And initially, they thought of maybe accrediting the training providers, but eventually they realized that because of the variations by which the licensees comply with the requirements, then they recognize that perhaps they should likewise accredit the trainers. So you can just imagine the original mandate is to provide licensing services, deliver that regulatory function. Now they added accreditation services, accreditation of training providers, as well as the trainers. So which of these will drive changes in the organizational outcome? Definitely the accreditation of trainers and the training institutions doesn't have to do with the purpose of licensing in a broader sense. So in that sense, we have to be clear about what drives the overall organizational outcome. So that should be one of the key considerations when you try to identify the key organizational output. So which of these is responsive to customer needs and expectations? Going back to our example in terms of the regulatory agencies, very few regulatory agencies would find time to explain to the regulated entities or the licensees or the permittees their responsibilities to the public. I still remember that when I transacted with government agency, when I applied for a license, the very first experience where it was explained to me my role when I before I was given the license, when I applied for a marriage license. But after that, for the other licensing, I have never come across of an effort of an agency to explain to me the purpose of that license. So in that sense, we probably are meeting customer needs and expectations, but we probably are failing in terms of explaining the responsibilities of the transacting public or the regulated entities, their responsibilities to the general public. So we have to consider these things. And again, you may also want to consider which of these outputs would account for majority of the agency's expenditure. So if you have the budget, say 90%, 80% of your budget is allocated in delivering a particular service or output or activities that are essential in the fulfillment of the agency's mandate. So these are some of the key questions that may guide in selecting the key outputs. I remember this was raised yesterday. The other thing to look into here is how we classify the outputs. There are, of course, tangible, intangible outputs. That's self-explanatory. There are final and intermediate outputs. So when you have the major final outputs as required by the Department of Budget and Management before shifting to PREC-C, we always are familiar with major final outputs, but there are also intermediate outputs. So For purposes of measuring public sector productivity, again, depending on your the information that you would like to generate and the level of the analysis, you will have to consider different types of outputs. The last point here, quality versus reject. This is very important type or types of outputs, the quality and those that are, shall we say, acceptable and non-acceptable or non-conforming public service or services or activities. Many agencies have gone through the quality management system and many are familiar with non-conforming on services. So if you're going to measure productivity, are you going to count all outputs regardless whether these are conforming or non-conforming to specified requirements? Some people would say that everything should be counted because at the end of the day, those outputs consume the resources, or you use a lot of resources in producing those outputs, and therefore they should likewise be counted. But from the perspective of organizational outcomes and satisfaction of the clients, of the citizens, customers, and so on, we have to always be reminded that not all of these outputs are conforming to specified requirements. Not all activities can be considered are conforming to these specified requirements. So that the challenge there is when we make adjustments in terms of the estimates of productivity and outputs, when we make adjustments based on quality parameters of the outputs. Quality is actually the link, a very important link between productivity and outcome. And in fact, in my personal perspective or view, quality should be an integral part in productivity estimation. You will see later on in terms of the examples, the importance of quality parameters. So we move on to the units of measure. So there are different types of outputs, different types of services in the government, regulatory services, delivery programs, policies, etc. When we talk of those different outputs, the question is, how do we measure them? Of course, physical units can be done. You can count the number of activities, number of services rendered, number of clients served, etc. So you can count them. But the challenge there, if you have several outputs, you cannot combine them together when they are in physical units. So sometimes we would prefer to use monetary values, revenue, sales, money values of the services rendered. But typically, the monetary values in government is not generally practiced, except when a government organization is a public enterprise or government-owned and controlled corporation that generates revenue. So to them, this is a very, very useful measure of the outputs. But in most cases, in the delivery of public health, education, typically the provision of these services, these are not presented in monetary values. So you may adopt equivalent units so that you will have a way of combining all of these different outputs in terms of standard units, standard time, full-time equivalent, etc. But in the principles provided in estimating public sector outputs, some experts would say that we should somehow adapt the way the national income accounting is done so that we can provide appropriate valuation of the public services. So here are some of the key principles that we may consider in estimating the outputs of a government agency. And let me highlight the principle B, that the output of the government sector should in principle be measured in a way that is adjusted for quality. In the exercises that we did, And in some practices that I've seen in the results of estimation, for instance, in the public school, when they use the number of students served as the proxy estimate of the services rendered. So even if the student failed or did not finish his or her studies, or there were problems in the learning of the student, that particular student will still be counted because accordingly, government expenditures have been allocated to serve that particular student. But the question, if you are producing many of these graduates who cannot even demonstrate functional literacy, assuming in that case, and we are counting them in productivity estimation, then we will have some issues later on. So we have to make adjustments for quality. The case of UK, for the longest time, they have been providing estimates of productivity. You can access their websites on this, and you'll find that the different statistical series on public sector productivity with adjustments for quality and those that were not adjusted for quality. And you'll find the different results and trends arising from those estimates. So adjustments in quality makes the calculation of productivity more meaningful. And traditionally, the output over input, the measures of output will have to make some adjustment. You have to apply the factor of quality to focus on more useful output. So the rest of these principles will guide you in going through the exercise of determining the more important outputs, how you calculate them in terms of the procedural process adopted in the national income accounts, and aligning these estimates the way the private sector outputs are measured in terms of the GDP, and are coming up with a real value of public services in the economy. So you can consider those points and coming up with some criteria as well to measure direct outputs of public sector. So there are practical approaches to measure the volume of public services. We are looking into the quantity of public services. So one way, as prescribed by those who went through a more advanced exercise on this, is to adopt the input method. The thing with the issue with the input method, you will always come up with a productivity ratio that is always 1. Output equals input, so you come up with 1. So the growth in output will always be equal to the growth in input. So that ratio will always be, there will be no change in productivity in that sense. The activity method, of course, there are agencies wherein you will not be able to see or easily count the output to be processed. Instead, you'll find a report on the activities undertaken, number of inspection activities, and things like that. So you can consider this as a method to measure the output. So you only simply count the activities because you will not be able to easily distinguish or separate the process from the output itself or the service itself. Now, the output method is the preferred one because it directly provides a way of counting the volume services that were received by the transacting public or the citizens. So the actual services rendered as opposed to the one that were offered. So we can count the actual services rendered to represent the public service outputs. The other one is the outcome method. This is a very ideal one, but eventually the results of public service will be a key interest to most of us, because at the end of the day, when we deliver a public service, the question is, are we contributing to societal outcomes, organizational outcomes, and bringing some benefits to the citizens? So for some, they feel that productivity in a broader sense should be defined as the ratio between outcome and the input. But traditionally, these are different things, no? But the issue with the outcome method, there are factors that are not directly in control or directly controlled by the agency. There are many other factors that may affect the changes on the outcomes. Unlike when you go into the direct output method or activity method, these are directly within the control of the agency. So there are also suggested approaches to measure the public services provided in the Eurostat handbook. So these are recommended way or approaches in measuring the volume. We have this ABC method, wherein there are certain criteria to adopt the A method. If all the criteria provided are satisfied, then you can use the A method. The output indicator is based on criteria that it should cover all services, and they should be weighted, and they should be detailed as possible, and they should be quality adjusted. So in the event that we cannot satisfy any of these criteria, then we go to the B method. And the C method is simply using an input or activity or outcome is used. And so the C method is not a direct measurement of the output. So for collective services, there are recommendations of which method to be adopted. So you can take a look at this reference. Then we move on to the steps in calculating the output indices. So if you have the physical measures, you can easily calculate the growth in outputs. But to sum them up, if there are several outputs, output A, B, C, D, or public service A, B, C, D, if we combine them, we have to determine their average share in the total cost. So to assign weights to these outputs before adding them into one index. So we have to calculate the weighted growth. So there's an approach to this one. Then proceed with the calculation of index. So we will see later on related results on this. So before proceeding further, let's have a quick quiz again. Let's see if you are still with me. So for those who are viewing now, kindly type in your answers to the question. And for this question, we are giving 30 points. So yesterday, we have 10 points and 20-point questions. So this time, we'll look into the 30-point questions. For those who attended the day one and the second day, I hope you will be able to get a perfect score and be recognized later on. So let's see. For a 30-point question, so which of the following is an outcome of healthcare facility? Letter A, medical treatment rendered. B, prescription drugs consumed. C, physical and mental well-being. And D, laboratory testing conducted. It's a very easy question, but this is 30 points just to check if we were able to understand the difference between outcome, output, and inputs. Okay, 30 seconds to answer this. I hope the secretary is able to monitor the answers in the chat box for those watching different platforms. Okay, so for this question, the answer is letter C. Why letter C? Item A is a kind of a service rendered or output. Prescription drugs consumed is an input, no? And then testing conducted could be a service rendered, so that will be an output. But the physical and mental well-being is an outcome. It depends on how well the patient, after being treated, will demonstrate better physical and mental well-being. So that's an outcome. Okay, so easy question for 30 points. So moving on, now we look at the input. So input refers to the resources that we consume in the production or delivery of the output. So it's rather confusing if you're making use of the output method in estimating output using the input method, because input refers equal to output. So that is being done in some cases. No? But generally speaking, the inputs may be illustrated in terms of the person hours, the lecture hours, expenses for incurred for processing document, materials used, the management time, machine time, etc. So these are kinds of inputs. And generally speaking, when we talk of inputs, just like the output, we have to have some guide questions here. So which input is most relevant to the purpose of your measurement? If your purpose is to determine and analyze labor productivity, then of course the more relevant input would be those pertaining to person hours, salaries, and wages, or equivalent, full-time equivalent spent of the individuals or staff, etc. Management time. So again, that will depend on your purpose of measurement. If you're concerned about multi-factor productivity analysis, then you have to consider different inputs. So the other question is, which input has a major impact on quality and productivity of key output? So when you analyze productivity and link this with quality and outcome, so some of these inputs you'll notice are the ones driving the changes in productivity and even quality. So we will see that in our examples later on. So which input is controllable? Largely controllable by the organization. That's a very practical point to consider. But the more important thing here is to reckon with your purpose of measurement. So what are the kinds of inputs? So we classify them into these 6 items, or we call this the CLEMS: capital, labor, energy, material, services done by others, and other non-operating inputs. So capital may refer to your machines, building, equipment, so time spent in, or the machine hours, equipment hours will represent the capital. And then labor, of course, may refer to our salaries and wages, number of employees, number of staff, management personnel, etc. So you can have those measures of labor inputs. Energy, of course, electricity, fuel, gas. That's very easy to consider. Materials, if you're using supplies and materials, etc. Then services done by others, when we hire external service providers, when we subcontract our operations, the services done by others, we call them as one of the inputs from outside. No? Non-operating inputs, when we donate something as part of our expenses and costs, or we subscribe to a membership in an association. Those are non-operating inputs. So now, similar with outputs, we have to first consider if these inputs can be measured in terms of physical units. This is the best way of measuring the inputs: person hours, machine hours, kilowatt hours. These are physical units, but the challenge here is how do we combine person hours with machine hours with kilowatt hours? It's not easy to do that unless we convert these things into equivalent units or monetary values. So if you use monetary values like salaries and wages, depreciation, etc., or expenditure on external services and so on. So we have this in monetary values. You can combine them, but when we estimate the inputs for labor, capital, etc., we have to deflate them to eliminate or minimize the effects of price changes. Because remember in productivity estimation, physical units of outputs divided by the physical units of input. So everything must be converted to physical units. So, but the challenge is how do we combine them? So we have the methodology to do that. So aggregation method, of course, we can combine each type of input using appropriate methodology and to come up with the same unit of input or measure, then deflate this to eliminate effects of price changes and come up with quantity estimates of these inputs. So there are methods as well. You can use the aggregate of these inputs or use the actual expenditure by category or by type, say capital expenditure, compensation, material cost, energy, etc. So by expenditure, you can classify them and then come up with a method to convert these into physical units. So we can use direct input per output or per service category based on the actual number of frontline staff, for instance, number of clients served in relation to the number of frontline staff. So we can also do that. That's our direct calculation, but it may give you a very limited meaning. Now, there are also principles adopted in estimating public sector inputs. And let me highlight the principle F, that the measurement of input should be as comprehensive as possible. And in particular, it should include capital services, labor inputs, etc. So when we look at the records of an agency, when you look at the reports of COA, Commission on Audit, financial reports, etc., you'll definitely somehow recognize some of these items in the statement of operations of an agency. So by looking at this available information or data, you can then proceed with the processing of the data. So how do we calculate for the input indices? First, if these are in physical units, of course, you can calculate the growth over a period of time. If these are not in physical units, then you have to make use of some deflators. But if you have data in terms of multiple outputs and multiple inputs combined together, then if it's difficult to disaggregate, then you can use the whole the aggregated data. But that again may affect your estimate. If your purpose is to come up with single factor productivity analysis, then aggregate data may not be that useful. So you have to come up with the details, how much is for the labor, how much is for the capital, etc. In any case, if we are combining different inputs, again, just like the outputs, we have to assign weights for each of them based on their relative contribution to the total cost and perhaps in terms of the different types of services rendered. So for, say, Department A that provides the frontline service, Department B catering to another frontline services. Some agencies would have standardization function. Some would have inspection function. The others may have regulatory function, and so on. So they would have different types of outputs, and likewise their inputs can be disaggregated according to those functions. Hopefully, depending on the reports that you have per agency. Then, following the methodology prescribed in this model, you can calculate the indices accordingly. So now we move on to the estimation of the output and input. So now you have the outputs and the inputs. Output index divided by the input index, you'll get the productivity index. So, but before proceeding with that, the question is what type of data are available and accessible, and how frequent can data be generated? So, can you do it regularly? Can you come up with a consistent series of data? And if you're going to make some processing of this data, will it require application of deflators, assigning weights, as well as making some adjustments for data that were not consistently reported across years or period of time? So things like that you may end up considering the practical and useful measures of outputs and inputs based on available data, assuming that these practical measures will help you achieve your purpose in measuring the productivity. So let me highlight that in any case, it's very important to ensure consistency and validity of the data that we are using. It's very crucial because when we analyze trends and we try to check whether the productivity estimates are the ones providing the necessary information, whether these are valid or not, then it will help us gain confidence in doing the productivity measurement. So there are principles prescribed in estimating the productivity. So there are 3 of them, but let me highlight principle E, that to the extent possible, measures of productivity should cover the whole of the government or of the organization, where systems for public service delivery and or data collection differ across different branches of the government. So we have to recognize that. The whole estimate, we have to recognize that across branches of the government, there are differences in terms of the services, the data collection. You will notice that in the example that we will share it to you shortly. So it's very necessary to reflect this variation in the choice of our productivity indicators. Okay, I mentioned about price indices, and there are 3 recognized approaches here: the Lapeyre's index, PAS index, and the chain linked index. The details of this you'll find in the OECD glossary of statistical terms, and these are also clearly illustrated in the APO's manual on productivity. So, but in my experience, the Lapeyre's index is commonly used because in here the current prices of commodities are deflated using the price of the same commodity or service at the base period. So meaning if for instance, the salary rate at year 1 is used to determine the total cost of compensation in the next succeeding years using that rate at year 1, instead of using different rates at different years. So the base period price is used to set the quantity estimates for the other years. For the PAS index, the current price of the commodity are deflated using price of the same commodity at the current period. So whatever is the rate at the moment, at this year or at this time, that will be used to estimate the quantities of the total cost of the other prior years data. So you will multiply the quantity of year 1, year 2, year 3 by the price at the current. So that's the past index. And chain link is a more practical way of joining the two indices, but the formula in doing this is quite long to cover, but the description, the examples are all illustrated in the APO manual. So here we go with the summary steps in estimating the public sector productivity. First is for us to determine the quantity of public service outputs using a direct volume approach to the extent possible. And we have to consider adjusting the volume measures for quality changes. So if we have data to support changes, analyze quality, then we can make use of that data to apply this factor in adjusting the quality as the output estimates. Then we have to measure the public service inputs using direct or indirect methods, depending on your available data. But if you're going to make use of the indirect method, you have to apply deflators and come up with the index accordingly. Then we'll calculate output and input and productivity indices using applicable methodologies. So there are many different methodologies for this. Now that you have estimated the productivity, it's time for us to examine the effects of productivity changes in the relevant outcomes of the organization or the public service. So if you're concerned about health, education, public safety, etc., and the changes that we notice in the productivity estimate will have to be examined as they affect the outcomes. And we can also relate the productivity changes with relevant past events to validate the information. In the example that I will show shortly, towards the end of this presentation, we were able to notice some of the changes in the policy that resulted in the significant changes in productivity and outcomes. Okay. So some practical guides. Start with simple measures. Focus on limited scope first, so that you gain some confidence in doing this. And where data is available, we can consider this for practical reasons. And of course, data should be reliable. Otherwise, the results of the estimate may be questioned. So you can develop measures in cooperation with different personnel involved. Say in an agency, the department level estimation, we have to include the operations department, the support group, and then look into how the different data were collected and can be analyzed to demonstrate the results of productivity changes across organizational processes. So this should be aligned with your overall objectives or societal goals so that we can examine how they relate to the achievement of the organizational objectives. And of course, your productivity estimate should give you the information that you need. And very important, it should lead to a corrective action to prevent recurrence of productivity-related issues. So practically, the productivity estimation is not only giving us the focus for productivity improvement, it should likewise give us confidence to gain control of the organizational outcomes. when we try to analyze productivity and understand its behavior, then we should gain some confidence that the outcomes can indeed be managed or controlled by focusing on the key areas for productivity improvement. So adjustments of measures may have to be considered based on collection experience, difficulty in the interpretation, and the types of information that we are generating. Now, in analyzing productivity, before proceeding further, let us pause for a while for our 40-point question. So I hope everybody is still with me. So please type in your answers to this question, whether A, B, C, or D. So in 40 points now, in analyzing productivity performance in government, which of the following may result in a lower productivity? Letter A, more and better services with the same resources. And B, more outputs of the same quality with fewer resources consumed. And then C, some amount of output with better quality using much more resources. Or is it D, a large gain in quantity and quality of outputs through a smaller increase in resources? So which one will result in lower productivity? Is it A, B, C, or D? So 30 seconds. Okay, so I guess most of you have typed in your answers. By the way, those who gave their answers that will be very useful for our secretariat to check your participation in this webinar. So which one is the answer? So if you look at the letter A, more and better services with the same resources. If you have more services delivered with the same resources, what does that mean? So it means higher productivity. Letter B, more outputs of the same quality with fewer resources. So lesser inputs, but more outputs. So it's a very ideal situation. So that's higher productivity. And then D, same amount of output. So constant quantity of outputs, although the quality may have improved, but the quantity is the same, using much more resources. So what will happen? So if you consume more resources for the same amount of output, expectedly the productivity will be lower. So it will be C, because D, large gain in quality and quantity of output, so meaning you were able to achieve higher quantities of outputs through smaller increase in resources, small increase for a larger gain. So expectedly productivity should be higher in item D. So the answer is C. I hope everybody got the highest score for this question. Okay, moving on, we look into the interpretation of changes of in productivity. So this is the one that we asked in the previous question. So there are changes in productivity arising from our approach or intention to produce more and better outputs depending on the amount of resources that we have. The problem in in many cases when we submit our accomplishments, the accomplishments of the agencies, typically we'll see there the number of major final outputs delivered. Or we also have reports on the outcomes, achievement of the outcomes, but seldom that we'll find reports showing how far have we improved or achieved the outputs in relation to the amount of resources that were utilized for the period. So in some cases, you'll find this productivity-based budgeting, so that the budget may be allocated in a more productive undertakings. But in the public sector, it's not always like that, because as I mentioned earlier, we should always examine the effects of productivity changes to the outcomes, because at the end of the day, the public sector, we are always concerned with outcomes, benefits, and so on. So for a profit-oriented government organization, if you recall the 9-box framework in understanding the relationship between productivity, profitability, and price recovery, this is the strategic grid for that. So in this graph, you will have on the horizontal line the price recovery negative. If you are not recovering much the change in cost of inputs, and we're not passing on to the consumer the change in price in our services, so the price recovery should be negative in that sense. But if, for instance, for every 10% increase in salary and electricity, then the price of our outputs or services will be increased by 20% or 15%. So that would mean a positive price recovery. On the other hand, the yellow vertical line is our productivity line. So above the horizontal, meaning positive productivity changes, and below that, you have the negative productivity changes. And the diagonal line is represented here as the profitability boundary, such that if you are not generating enough profits, meaning the government enterprise is losing, then the agency should be below this dotted line or in this left side. And if the agency is generating profit, then the agency will be on this upper right side of the graph. So the question is, what is the typical way of addressing the rising cost of our expenses? So the tendency is to recover that by increasing our price or budget, and typically that may even lead to negative profitability for some, because the productivity has been negative or declining, although the price recovery is increasing. But eventually, in a very competitive market situation, that enterprise may not be able to generate enough profit. So you experience net loss. So to be more profitable, the tendency of the organization would be to increase the rates, the price of their services, the outputs, to gain more profit. But after some time, competitors will overtake us in the market. So what is the ideal situation here? Of course, if all are positive, price recovery, productivity, and profitability, that's the ideal one. But in a highly competitive market, the more strategic positioning should be at that point where your profitability is positive, productivity is positive, although your price recovery is negative. So in the export market, for instance, those exporters that are able to penetrate well the export market, they rely heavily on improvements in productivity and gain profits through that, because they cannot simply increase the prices of their products. And as you know, in the export market, if you make use of price recovery strategy, you will end up losing the market soon. For non-profit organization, if you're going to make use of this productivity strategic grid, So for instance, if we replace profitability with outcome, meaning that the organizational outcome is positive. If positive, then it should be above the diagonal line, or negative outcome, meaning declining outcomes, then that should be below the dotted line. So just like the previous one, the tendency of some agencies, every budget, when they present the budget, they will say that because of inflation, please increase our budget. Although the quantity of outputs may not increase, no? But in many cases, the targets would increase higher than the approved budget. So that's the problem. In that case, the strategy should be more to become more productive, so that we can produce better organizational results. So positive productivity despite negative price recovery. What does negative price recovery in budgeting? When we propose our budget, for instance, there's a 10% increase in salary, 5% increase in the cost of fuel, and then when we propose for an increased budget, no increase in budget was given to us, same budget as last year, and yet we are expected to produce higher results. So how do we achieve that? Same budget, but better results. So we have to be more productive to deliver better outcomes, because price recovery wise, negative. We were not able to increase our budget. So that's the way to look into these strategic grids. The way to sustain operation is to be more productive, so that we can produce positive outcomes despite negative adjustments in budget given the price changes. So in pursuing public sector productivity, there are many challenges. Of course, one of which is that until now, the conceptual framework for public sector productivity, this varies across economies, across countries, across agencies. And there's a need to create a clear conceptual framework for public sector productivity to serve a particular purpose. In the private sector, the main purpose of increasing productivity is very clear, straightforward. Increase profit and gain market share, better market share. Very easy. But in the public sector, we have a wide concern to deal with, and therefore the framework may vary, because we have to understand what factors may drive a change in public sector productivity. And we have to recognize the diversity of public sector objectives and operation. Given this, the framework may have to be adjusted to serve this characteristic of the public sector. We also have to recognize that there's no single methodology that we can use to measure public sector productivity. As you may recall, there are many ways of doing this, from the measurement of the outputs itself, the inputs, as well as the key considerations in estimating the productivity. There are many ways of doing this. So there's a need to complement macro level measures with micro level measures to examine what drives the changes in productivity. And we have to come up with a multidimensional approach to analyze the productivity of various agencies, because some agencies' outputs can only be measured by counting the number of activities that they have rendered. Some may have a very clear direct output, like those in healthcare, in education, social services. So you can easily count them, but there are combination of these activities that we cannot simply count these services rendered. Instead, you have to count the activities. And in some cases, you cannot make use of the activities conducted, but more on the inputs used. So this leads us to this very important challenge in measuring public sector productivity. There's a very weak institutional mechanism for regular data collection, analysis, and planning and tracking of productivity performance in the public sector. So if you look at the different institutions, which of the institution can be said responsible for data collection? Is it part of the statistical body, or is it part of another agency? And then who is going to provide productivity analysis that can be used to set certain productivity standards that can be used for budgeting, for policy directions, and so on. And more importantly, if there are estimates of productivity, if certain targets are set, how do we track productivity performance to see whether those changes in productivity that we're tracking are indeed the ones meaningful to effect substantial improvements in organizational outcomes. So that gives us this essence that if you are to design institutions to undertake this, productivity information, you have to recognize, is not commonly used for policy and decision making. You will recall in the examples that we presented, it's very important to recognize certain standards, say the student teacher ratio, student classroom ratio, patient to bed ratio, etc. So things like that may give us some insights on how certain standards may be obtained through productivity estimation. Of course, there are many other challenges, and let me highlight that the intra-governmental coordination and productivity measurement is very, very important. Other than the typology of activities, output measurement, standardization, and so on, it's very important to have this horizontal coordination on productivity measurement. The other thing from the other studies, from Atkinson's review, final report, they highlighted many other challenges pertaining to the methodology. But let me highlight a very important point emphasized in that report, that productivity estimate should take into account quality changes. So that gives us the essence that quality should be an integral part of the productivity estimation. Okay, so now I think we have time to share the results about productivity calculations this time in the public hospital. Let me do this very quickly. So we look at the national objectives for health during the periods of 2011 to 2016. So there's this objective pertaining to financial risk protection, improvement in access, and attainment of health-related medium development goals. So we examined how the healthcare services are delivered, and we look at the delivery system. So we have barangay health operations, rural health, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And based on this level, they provide services for public health, primary cases, secondary cases, and tertiary cases. In the private, typically it's a combination of this, but in the public sector, somehow these are defined depending on the classification of the hospital. So we're focusing on the public hospitals, and a number of output measures were identified, but we made use of proxy estimates of healthcare services provided. So in this case, we simply made use of the number of inpatient served, outpatient served, number of service patients, and or non-paying patients, and the pay patients. So then in terms of inputs, there are many available data as well. Health professionals, number of beds, energy consumption, capital, operating expenses, actual budget disbursement, and so on. So these are fairly available across a number of public hospitals. Then on quality, these are the typical perspectives that we have seen: percentage of clients that were satisfied, inpatients that acquired infections, relapse cases, and reduction in medical errors. The last point, reduction in medical errors, is very difficult to find in many other hospitals. So what's the result? You'll see here the estimates of productivity trends of selected public hospitals from 2006 to 2016. And notice that the total productivity has been declining, or declined from 2006 to 2016. An average of somehow 11%, and then productivity drop of 34% in 2010 to 2016 for labor productivity, and total productivity 27% drop. Okay, so having seen the trend, we looked at a particular hospital. So notice the different trend in the aggregate hospital analysis. In this case, we examine the number of patients served in a particular hospital, service patients, pay patients, emergency patients, and the outpatients. Notice the declining number of service patients or non-paying patients as against the number of pay patients, those who paid for the services provided by the ABC hospital. Emergency cases has been rising, and the total outpatient numbers has been rising as well. Now, if you look at the services rendered, inpatient, outpatient services, we have seen upward trends in all cases. Now, in terms of inputs, we noticed upward trends in many of these inputs considered. Human resources or labor, intermediate inputs, capital inputs, total inputs, as well as the bed capacity. So notice the upward trends. So upward trends in outputs or services, upward trends in terms of the inputs. So what happened to some of the productivity parameters? If we look at the number of inpatients per doctor and the number of outpatients per doctor, you will see some declining trend. So this may show or represent some productivity in information. Another thing, we examine the bed utilization. It's somehow improving during that period, but the number of patients per bed has been declining. So again, this may have a bearing on the overall productivity results. Now, in terms of productivity of this particular hospital, we have noted a generally declining total productivity performance. While the capital productivity is also declining, intermediate inputs, well, it fluctuated during the period, but the labor or HR productivity generally showed a declining trend. And you may notice that the overall or the total productivity pattern somehow is following the intermediate input productivity that pertains to other supplies and materials and other medicines, etc. So possibly because that would be the major input for the hospitals. Now, in terms of the perspectives of productivity, given the data limitation. Let's say that the estimates of productivity performance were primarily focused on the count of patient services rendered. So without adjustments on whether such services resulted to a positive healthcare result. So that was the first observation. And the current estimates of productivity for selected public hospitals showed a generally declining trend. Now, we also looked into the public healthcare quality. So looking into this perspective, considering that there were only few hospitals included in the estimation, the national level healthcare outcomes were used. So we were not able to gather quality-related trends on this cluster of hospitals because the data varies across hospitals. So we looked at the overall. Overall, public healthcare quality outcome results. Fertility rate has been declining while mortality rate has been slightly improving. And infant and maternal death rates were likewise declining very slowly in terms of maternal rate, death rate, and infant death rates was also declining. So those are better or good signs of improving outcomes, healthcare outcomes. So some challenges that we noted here in improving productivity. So there was this very concerned about breakdown of the referral network. So that resulted to overcrowding of tertiary facilities. So meaning that for those who are supposed to be taken to secondary hospitals, they were also taken and attended to in the tertiary facilities. So there seems to be some issues of breakdown of the referral system. And there were also issues pertaining to overstaying patients, which entailed a much longer waiting time and additional costs for the hospital. And there were also issues pertaining to a higher health services cost and due to probably mismatch in the capability of tertiary facilities as they serve other cases that should have been taken to other specialty or say other levels of facilities. So of course, recurring concern about limited funding support. That's why many of the government or some government hospitals would cater to paying patients, as you have seen in the number of paying patients that we have served. So the downward trend in productivity of selected public hospitals could be expected as the government provided more resources to effect improvements in the outcomes. So they added more doctors, more beds, more laboratories. So definitely that will incur more inputs relative to the, although increasing number of patients, but when you compare outputs to inputs, we notice a downward trend. But on the positive side, despite the downward trend in productivity, we noticed an improving health risk financing, improvements in focus on preventive health care. We took note of that. And the efforts to intensify the provision of some technical services to a number of these hospitals. So there were shifts from curative healthcare to preventive healthcare. So these are very welcome developments. And in terms of policies, we could say that in determining the effective levels of patient, doctor, and bed capacity utilization rates and making health facilities adequate and accessible, this should lead to better healthcare outcomes. And hopefully, this should include measures to broaden preventive and promotive healthcare services instead of the curative healthcare services, and we may rationalize the referral system because we noted some failure in that. There's also a need to bring down the cost of risk financing and address the capacity and capability gaps of public hospitals. And possibly we need to intensify measures to adopt international standards on patient safety. This is to meet the growing demands for affordable and more effective healthcare services in the country. So that concludes this analysis of that case. So hopefully we can have some questions and exchanges of views or observations of this. So thank you very much. You know, entertain questions at this point.
Thank you so much for the remarkable presentation, Director Abanto. My personal key takeaway from that presentation is that quality itself should be an integral part in productivity estimation, and that the output of any government sector should in principle be measured in a way that is adjustable always for quality. First layer po yan. So, all right, let's go ahead and answer some of the questions from our webinar participants. One question here, sir. How do we convince institutions or policymakers to appreciate productivity measurement and estimation?
Very tough, very difficult to convince. But let me share that if there are studies available and we can demonstrate how the information may be used to provide evidences on certain policy, then that should build their confidence in making use of the productivity information for policy making. Of course, there were many attempts before, and I strongly believe that many of the policy or decision makers are open to use productivity information. But the question is, do we have productivity information available? I believe they will appreciate this thing. But do we have this information? That's the first thing. If we don't have this information, that points to the productivity gaps. And do we have reliable productivity estimates? Then I believe we can convince them to use this. No? Yeah.
Okay, sir. Another question from Reed Makayan. How can we convince our office that we need better device for productivity? Like examples are mid-range computer for every employees. I think he's pertaining to capacitating the employee.
Well, again, make use of the productivity estimates to provide evidence that indeed by providing such equipment, it will yield better services, faster services, and so on. So that's the beauty of providing these estimates, because this can possibly support or even justify provision of such resources. We know for a fact that many agencies are, complaining for the lack of budget, limited resources, limited equipment, lack of people, and so on, or limited number of people. But we always complain about these things. But where are the data? Do we have evidences to show that such limitations are indeed contributing to a lower or poorer organizational outcome? So perhaps the estimates will help you on that.
Agree on that, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, another question from Luz Ferraren. To sum it up, your discussion, sir, is it how we manage efficiently and effectively our budget and come up with quality outcomes?
Well, managing the budget is one thing, but the actual practices is another thing. And at the end of the day, of course, we have the budget. Given the budget allotted to us, we are expected to use them. Even if we use them based on the intention, if the outcomes are not improving well, of course, you will go back to how are we, how well are we managing or using the budget allotted to us. But there are issues related to budget, as we know. In the past, in some years, no, I often heard agencies complaining. So they have this budget, and yet the funds were released quite late. But this time, I know the fund releases are more on timely now compared before. So they were complaining on that, and then so how can they make use of that budget when you don't have timely releases of the fund? With that experience of some agencies before, and looking into this issue, I like to believe that during those days, one of the drivers of public sector productivity would be the allocation of the budget, how well we allocate the limited resources that we have. And the other thing that may drive public sector productivity is how soon do we release the funds for that budget, because budget is different from the actual releases, because you cannot you cannot perform activities when there are no actual releases. Those were the complaints before. But this time, I believe many of those issues have been addressed. So we can probably examine this time what could be the more meaningful drivers of productivity in the public sector. Is it the quality of our people? Definitely, competent people. But are they engaged? That's another thing. So if we have competent and well-engaged workforce, but do we have the systems, better systems, for them to be more productive? So assuming we have good management systems, we have good people around, but if our technology are antiquated, we may not be able to optimize productivity as well. So there are many factors to look into. It's not just how well you manage your budget, because definitely these are management concerns.
Agree, sir.
We have to look into.
Actually, technological advancement is one of the tenets of productivity. So
yeah,
side by side. Innovation.
Right.
Another question, sir, from Ms. Chona Sunar Narvades. If productivity is measured in terms of the bottom line or the net income, is there a way to compute productivity to show its contribution to the net income?
Well, as illustrated yesterday, productivity affects profitability. So if you're thinking of net income, it reflects profitability. So if you have more net income, you're more profitable. Question is, where's that net income coming from? Is it a result of price recovery, which is a typical way of addressing the price changes, increasing cost? So every percentage increase in cost increased your price. So that's price recovery. And of course, by that, you will generate profit. Imagine if there's a 5% increase in cost, and then you price your output, increase the price of your output by 10%, and you're able to sell them, then definitely your profit will increase significantly. But can you sustain that? Because if the situation is very profitable, then other players will come in. There will be more competitors who are more productive, who will compete with your price. So for the same cost, across companies, across agencies, who can deliver faster, better services at lower price, then that one will win the market. And they can earn profit as well in terms of volume.
Yes,
so
sir.
That the methodology that I illustrated, the TFP, is a very powerful model. It can even estimate up to the last centavo how much net income will you be able to generate for a percentage increase, say in labor productivity, a percentage increase in capital productivity. How much will it contribute to your profitability? That's the beauty of productivity accounting. It's very powerful. It's used in the private sector. It's difficult to use in the government. Unless you're a GOCC, you can use it. Yeah.
I think, sir, we can accommodate one more question from Luz
Yes, please.
Ferraren. Can we include employability of the graduates as measurement of productivity, especially for CHED and TESTA? I think she's pertaining to the discussion yesterday.
Oh, that's outcome. It's not that's not an outcome measure. And if you examine productivity and you're able to improve employability, meaning your productivity strategies are well in place because you're producing quality graduates, so they're very well employable. So therefore, your productivity is very good. So in that sense, if you expand the context of productivity, outcome in relation to inputs, and the outcome is measured in terms of employability, now you can do that, of course. But remember, employability, there are other factors that may affect that. It's not only the ones controlled by the educational institution. There are other factors that may contribute to that, the employability of the individual. So on that note, you can very well link the two, productivity and outcome in terms of employability.
Employability. Thank you, sir. I think, sir, we received one comment from Grace Marjorie Recta. Quality management system plus good people plus technological advancement is equal to higher productivity. I definitely concur with this, sir.
Yes. You remember the framework that I presented earlier? There are three factors that may contribute to higher total factor productivity. Improvement in your workforce, of course, in your system, and in your technology. Those three. Yes.
Thank you, sir. I think that's it. That's all the time we have for today, sir. Everyone, thank you very much to our resource person for this webinar series on measuring public sector productivity, Managing Director Arnel D. Abanto. Final reminders to those who were not able to accomplish the evaluation form and post-test for session 1, links to the evaluation and post-test for both days are pinned in the comment section of our social media accounts. We also remind all participants that in order to be granted an e-certificate, you must accomplish all the evaluation forms and pass all the post-tests. So that's it for the webinar series on measuring public sector productivity. See you all in our next webinars. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much, Sir Arnel.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope that the next run we will be able to discuss how we measure quality.
Definitely,
quality
sir.
in the public sector. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.